Cool.
On time.
Sorry?
Exactly on time.
I try. Okay, so it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Johannes Müller-Trede, who is a young but already very well published scholar who published in such top journals as Management Science and Psych Science. Johannes' main interests are in the field of learning from data and its translation to decisions. And the second is why we are often inconsistent in our decisions. So Ori, please listen carefully because you are always inconsistent. Um, Anyways, we will proceed as follows. So now we will have about 45 to 50 minutes for the talk, and then about 10 to 15 minutes for the questions. And then those who have to go will be able to go. And those who want to stay for another 15 minutes or so for an informal discussion are welcome to stay. Johannes, now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Efim. Thank you for the introduction and for the invite. I'll be talking to you about the psychology of losses here, and I'll be talking to you about two different strands of research that I've been working on with my co-authors over the last years that raise, I think, some questions about how the psychology of losses works. And to start you off, given that this is a decision seminar, I'll show you a classic decision-making finding that goes back to Kahneman and Tversky, which is the Asian disease problem. So this is an implementation of the Asian disease problems that we ran some years back. And really everything here in terms of the parameters is exactly the same as it was in the original version of the problem. The only thing is that we're not talking about an Asian disease, but about an unusual disease because it's 2024. And what we get here in the classic problem is the classic framing effect, which is that we get clear majority risk aversion for gains, whereas we get clear majority risk seeking for losses. When we ran this, we didn't just run the original version of this problem, but we also ran a version in which instead of describing the outcomes in terms of absolute numbers, we described the outcomes in terms of proportions. That's the version that you can see here. Everything else is unchanged. The Asian disease problem lends itself very nicely to this because you have to set up the gain-loss framing effect. You have to talk about 600 inhabitants to begin with, so you can also very naturally talk about proportions. And this was part of a line of studies in which we were looking at how the numerical descriptors that we use to describe outcomes in choice problems affect our risk preference. And what we found was that when instead of expressing the outcomes here in the Asian disease problems in terms of absolute numbers, we expressed them in terms of proportions, we got an attenuated framing effect, much weaker framing effect, in which we still had risk aversion for gains, but in fact the risk seeking for losses, which would be the rightmost bar here, was no longer significantly different from 50%. So there was no longer that majority preference. And so the way in which we describe the outcomes, the numbers that we use to describe the outcomes mattered here. And this is part of a line of studies that we published in 2018, where we looked at exactly this question. Here we show that the effective outcome framing is kind of like a framing interaction. The effective outcome framing, gains versus losses, depends on the numerical framing, absolute versus proportions. Now, the bigger picture here in terms of the theory, so I flew that off with an effect, but there are theoretical ideas behind this, was that we wanted to know how number perception might matter to risk preference. And so in the classic prospect theory setup, what you have is you have the value function, where you have diminishing sensitivity away from the reference point, both in terms of gains and in terms of losses. And in the way that we normally think about this is that we have diminishing sensitivity to the actual outcomes. So the idea is that the difference between €1, say, or 1 shekel or $1 and 10 euros is a larger difference to us than the difference between 101 euros and $110. And there the classic interpretation of this finding is that this is effectively about how we subjectively value gains and losses. That's what prospect theory focuses on a lot. The idea of how do the outcomes translate to subjective valuations of these outcomes. But when you look at these kind of stimuli, you can also think about diminishing sensitivity to numbers. And there's research in number perception that goes back at least until the 1970s, where when people are asked to rate numbers in terms of how large they seem to them, the difference between a 1 and a 10 is much more of a difference. It's a much larger difference than the difference between the 101 and the 110. And this really is about perception of some form, where it's about how we subjectively process the numerical descriptors of the outcomes, so the gains and losses that are being described to us. And what we find in that series of studies that we published then was that diminishing sensitivity in the usual kind of studies that we do in labs, where we use simple gambles, appears to be partly due to diminishing sensitivity to numbers, not to outcomes. And from there, we thought the next question that would be of interest was like, what might happen if there's no numbers? So if we take away the numbers, what do we get? Do we still get the usual pattern of risk aversion for gains and risk seeking for losses? Or if that diminishing sensitivity is partly because of numbers, what could we get instead, right? And so the domain that we decided to focus on in particular is the domain of losses and the notion that we have risk seeking for losses. First, and this is for several reasons. First, because in the problem that I just showed you in the modified Asian disease problem, we did not find risk seeking for losses. Second, and perhaps most importantly, there's a very strong independent reason that is not about numbers, but it's about actual content that leads to risk aversion for gains, which is the classic expected utility story of the same difference matters less to a poor person than it matters to a rich person, going back to Bernoulli. But the issue is that, like, this argument says you'll get risk aversion for gains. It also says in principle that you should be risk averse across the whole spectrum, so also for losses. So if that were true, then our idea that like if we take away the numbers, we would still get risk aversion for gains. So we would not be able to make any new predictions in the gain domain, but we would make different predictions in the loss domain, where we might say, okay, based on Bernoulli's independent arguments, you might expect there to be risk aversion for both losses and gains. So that's where we focused our studies on.
Johannes, I have
yes,
a question.
Peter, yes,
I don't know how to define risk aversion if no number. What is on the x-axis if there are no numbers?
That's right. So it becomes that took us about 2 years to figure out in terms of like how do we best think about this and what it means for there to be diminishing sensitivity when you no longer have a numerical axis like in the illustration that I have here, right? So like you're right in some sense that the illustration here is a little bit confusing. When I now move to the studies, I'll show you how we formalize that in those studies, and there we just do not use a scale like this. And then I hope it makes sense again, but it's a good point. Okay, this is what I just went over, the idea that by Bernoulli's argument, you might have sensitivity to losses that's accelerating, and therefore you have risk aversion for losses also. Another argument that is sometimes given for risk seeking for losses is that losses are like pain. And so another thing that we did is we went back to the psychological literature on pain and looked at what subjective valuations of pain look like. And here I'm showing you one plot of thermal pain. So as you expose people to hotter and hotter temperatures, what you actually find here is accelerating sensitivity to this pain. So as the temperatures get hotter and hotter, the increases in pain get larger. This is published in the relevant journal Pain. The same was found way back by a famous psychologist at Harvard called Stevens, when he looked at pain of electric shocks, and he administered electric shocks to people and then tried to measure the psychophysics of that. And he also found that as you increased, so the same increase in ampere mattered less for very weak currents, and it mattered more for already stronger currents. So there you have again accelerating sensitivity to pain. So at the very least, the psychophysics of pain do not reveal clear diminishing sensitivity. And all of this together made us think, okay, maybe when we look at losses and we take away the numerical descriptors, we might get risk aversion rather than risk seeking. And so in trying to figure out what Peter was asking, which is how couldn't we actually study this when we no longer have an axis, like a neat numerical axis that you can rely on. The first thing that we did is, well, we might as well just ask people. So we did a very simple study and only described to people the notion of a non-specified qualitative gain and the non-specified qualitative loss. We don't exactly say how much it is. We say it's a lot or a little. We don't say exactly how likely things are. At least in the top, there's a small probability. At the bottom, we say for sure. Of course, this kind of design has its shortcomings, and in particular, we don't exactly know how people construe all of these qualifiers here. But what we found interesting, we thought it would still be worth asking, because there is, of course, a clear analogy between the two problems. And we thought it was interesting that when we did this, we just found risk aversion across the board, and no such thing as a reflection effect where you would have the risk preference differ across gains and losses. So maybe we thought there's something here. Maybe when you take away the numbers, they're really you might no longer get the usual risk seeking for losses. But of course, there are shortcomings to the study, so we thought, well, how can we do this in a more formal way? And what we ended up with was basically we went back to kind of basic microeconomics in some sense, and just said, okay, well, if you think about two goods that you can lose, or two general losses, you can have a smaller and a larger loss, so that the larger loss is more painful than the smaller loss. And then for an incremental loss x, so this is the third loss that you can either add to the smaller or to the larger baseline, then diminishing sensitivity would be something like, if I add this incremental loss to this larger baseline, it'll hurt less than when I add it to the smaller baseline. So here now I don't no longer need an axis in terms of numbers. I just think about these individual losses. And another way to, or something that you can derive very simply from that inequality is, if you let the smaller loss be no loss and then the incremental loss be another small loss, you end up with the inequality at the bottom here, where what we say is that losing two things together should be less painful than losing each of them in separation and then summing the disutility of the two. Both of these effectively would be what would be implied by prospect theory, the idea of you have diminishing sensitivity to losses themselves. And of course, this is not about numbers in the way that I'm putting this here. The intuition is losing both goods is less painful than the sum pain of losing each good in isolation. And so we ran several studies where we tried to test this, where we tried to test these inequalities. The first that we ran was one where we said, imagine you currently own a TV that you enjoy watching and a bicycle that you enjoy riding. Now imagine you have to make a choice involving potential losses of these goods. And in particular, you have two options. If you choose option A, then you lose one of the goods selected at random, but you don't know which, and you won't lose the other. If you choose option B, then you have a 50% chance of losing both the goods and a 50% chance of not losing anything. So this is what you see here in the table. Of course, when you design this kind of study, you wouldn't want the goods to be complements or substitutes, because if they were, then that features, so their complementarity or their substitutability, would determine your risk preferences more so than like some general tendency that you might have for risk aversion or for risk seeking as some sort of psychological baseline. And we thought that the TV and bike met these conditions. We also ran the design afterwards with other kinds of stimuli to make sure that this is not about just the specifics one that we picked here. And so prospect theory here predicts that you would prefer to like lose the two of them together rather than lose one of them, but you don't know which. If you think about the value of the two, this is traditional prospect theory here, not cumulative prospect theory, but for cumulative prospect theory, the same kind of thing holds as long as you assume usual the usual kind of parameterizations. You basically end up with prospect theory saying you'd like to bundle the losses, and some general notion of risk aversion saying, well, maybe you do not want to bundle the losses, but you'd rather only lose one rather than expose yourself to the possibility of losing two. And that is what we found when we first ran the study. We found a very clear majority preference for people not wanting to lose both the bike and the TV at the same time, but instead they were okay with losing one of them and not knowing which one they would lose. Okay, so this is some evidence for risk aversion for qualitative losses, where we no longer have numerical descriptors that describe the outcomes, but the outcomes are just, in this case, these consumer goods. Something that we did afterwards was, okay, the version that we first ran had this particular well, special feature, let's call it, that was a little different from what you usually see when you think about safe options, which is that in the safe option, or the safer option of the ones that I just showed you, these ones here, even in the safer one, there's a version of uncertainty because you don't know which of the two goods you will be losing. So we figured we could try to run this in a way where we do this between subjects and make it very concrete that you either lose the bicycle, that would be the top condition here, or you lose the TV. And you have to choose between that and the 50% chance of losing both. Of course, in this kind of design here, unlike the previous one that I showed you, what will happen is if you have a strong preference for one item over the other, so if you much prefer the TV, then that will drive your choices here, and you will get risk seeking in one condition and risk aversion in the other, right? In the previous design that I showed you, that's actually, it doesn't matter how big the difference between the utility of the items is. You always get the prediction that that I just showed you. Here, if you got these kinds of inconsistent risk attitudes, then we would have just found out something about whether people like the TV more or they like the bike more, but that's not so interesting to us. If, on the other hand, you were to find consistent risk aversion across the two qualitative conditions, so the two top conditions here, that would be further in line with the notion that we might not have, in general, diminishing sensitivity to losses when there are no numbers involved. This study also included a standard monetary condition where we just had the subjects choose between losing 400 for sure or a 50% chance of losing 800, which might be roughly in line with how much a bike and a TV might cost. Here, of course, because we have numbers again, both our account and prospect theory would predict that you get risk seeking for losses. So people should prefer the bottom option. What we find here is that we got risk aversion for the qualitative items. So even when we separate this across conditions, it appears to be the case that the utility difference between the bicycle and the TV is not that large. And instead we get at like some baseline tendency for risk aversion for qualitative losses. On the other hand, when you run this with numerical stimuli, you get this standard prospect theory finding that you get risk seeking for losses instead. One last study in this line of work uses a slightly different paradigm. This actually took us a long time to come up with. We had the two studies I just showed you. We ran them some years ago, and we thought that they were really interesting. But we wanted to, or we thought that we would like to have another demonstration of this kind of thing, which wouldn't be quite exactly the same paradigm. And we ended up coming up with this one maybe a year ago or so, which to our minds kind of really strengthens the overall package that we have here, the overall evidence that we have for this notion of risk aversion for qualitative losses. Here, what we did was we asked people to say, here, which of these items do you own or do you not own? So these are 16 consumer items that we thought that many of our participants might own. We ran this on Prolific in the States. If you said you owned at least one of the items and you didn't own at least one other of the items, then we did random assignment to gains versus losses. And then here on the right-hand side, you see the next screen for the people in the loss condition. So this is first sentence says, consider the items that you do own from the previous list. For each item below, please indicate how much you personally like the item. If you rated at least one of the items 4 or 5, then we included you in the studies because we wanted people to make, like we wanted, these were of course hypothetical choices, but we wanted them to feel meaningful. So if people just had owned something but that they wouldn't care about, then we might not get the kinds of things that we were interested in, because people might just not take the study all that seriously. If you were included, then you saw either one of these, depending on whether you were in the gain condition or in the loss condition. You see that these are basically parallel. You have to make a choice between two potential gains or two potential losses on the left or on the right. In these, you have a monetary baseline, both in the gain condition and in the loss condition, where you have a smaller monetary amount and a larger monetary amount. And then you have an additional item, which is the one that you had rated as you would really like to have this item, or you really like having this item in the previous stages of the study. So here on the left-hand side, this would be somebody who doesn't currently have an air fryer, but would really like to have one. And we asked basically the design here in choosing between A and B, you basically have a choice between pairing the gain of the air fryer either with the smaller monetary baseline or with the larger monetary baseline. So you can bundle the quantitative and the monetary gain and either like hedge in some sense, which is the top, the risk averse option, where you bundle the qualitative gain with the smaller monetary baseline. So you have a meaningful win in either case. Or you can kind of double down, which is the bottom option, where you bundle the qualitative loss with the larger monetary baseline gain, sorry. And the exact same for losses over here, right? Here again, also here, you own the air fryer and then you stand to lose either 20 or 400. And would you rather lose the air fryer alongside with the smaller monetary loss, or would you rather lose it alongside the larger monetary loss? And here also the top is effectively like some version of hedging, and the bottom is the doubling down option, which is the risk-seeking option. And even though here the baselines are quantified, the thing that changes between the two options is, of course, the qualitative loss. So we have no numerical descriptions of the air fryer here. And if our reactions to the air fryer then go back to some version of baseline risk aversion, then we would expect risk aversion across the two conditions, whereas prospect theory predicts a reflection effect where you get risk aversion on the left, but risk seeking on the right. And what we found was that we found, again, more evidence for risk aversion when people make choices involving qualitative gains and losses. Okay, this is from the write-up of the studies from the working paper that we have. I'm not going to go into all the details. These are more variations on these studies paradigms that I've shown you here. The key takeaway here is that the solid blue are all studies involving qualitative losses, so losses where we don't use numerical quantifiers, and we consistently get risk aversion for these qualitative losses. This one here, the shaded blue, is the qualitative gain that you just saw just on the previous screen. There you also get risk aversion. On the other hand, in these studies, when it's about monetary losses that are described in terms of numbers, we get evidence for risk seeking, consistent with prospect theory, but also with our account. Okay, so to sum up this first part of the talk, the idea here is that we basically target risk seeking for losses, and we ask when do you find risk seeking for losses? And following up on the work that we've done before, we find that risk seeking for losses does obtain when you have the standard numerical scales, but you don't have it when the losses are quantified on these bounded scales, like in the Asian disease problem that I started with, and you don't have it when the losses are these consumer goods that are described qualitatively. So that suggests that risk-seeking for monetary losses might be primarily driven by diminishing sensitivity to numbers, not diminishing sensitivity to outcomes. And it kind of raises the question whether something like dispositional risk aversion, baseline risk aversion, could be the norm for losses just as well as gains. That concludes the first part of the talk. In the second half of the talk, we're going to have to talk about loss aversion, which is the other big innovation of prospect theories in terms of what the psychology of losses might be like. And here we have a different line of work that speaks to this question. I'll again start off with an empirical finding and a standard empirical finding. We're going to look at the endowment effect in a version that we did some years ago when I was still at UC San Diego as a pen and paper study with students there, where two conditions that we had in the study were standard endowment effect conditions. Here, the first one I'm showing you is you're endowed with money. We'd like to know your cutoff for buying the mug. That is, what is the greatest amount of money you'd be willing to pay for the mug? Think about whether you would buy the mug for different amounts of money and fill in the blank to complete the sentence below. For any amount of money below so-and-so, I would buy the UCSD mug. Endowed in terms of money is just that you have some money, right? Like we didn't actually explicitly give money to these people. In the other hand, you have the WTS condition, the selling condition, where we say we'd like to know your cutoff for selling the mug. That is, what is the smallest amount of money you'd be willing to accept for the mug. Think about whether you would sell the mug for different amount of money and fill in the blank to complete the sentence below. And what we find when we did these standard endowment effect conditions is a standard endowment effect by which the willingness to sell prices are much higher than the willingness to buy prices. And this, of course, like one way in which people have explained this finding is in terms of loss aversion, although there are also others. But this is one of the classic empirical signatures of loss aversion when that you come across very often. What we did in addition in this study was that we had two conditions where we had no endowments. So we basically had an equivalent of the two conditions that I just showed you, in which there's no endowment, and all that you have to do is you have to choose between a mug, and you have to choose between the mug and some amount of money. And so here the idea is, well, think about some amount of money and think about the UCSD mug, and you get to choose between some money and the UCSD mug. And now tell me, what's the greatest amount of money for which you would still take the mug over the money? Okay, this is, there's no endowment. It's just you're going to get either one of the two. But I'm asking you in terms of what's the greatest amount of money for which you would still take the mug over the money. In the other condition, we had the same kind of setup, no endowment, choice between money and the mug, but instead of asking about the greatest amount of money for which you would still take the mug over the money, in the other condition we asked, what's the smallest amount of money for which you would still take the money over the mug? Okay, and here the idea is that these effectively line up with the buying or with the selling and the buying conditions from the previous study. But there's no notion of a loss here because you're not endowed with anything. So you're never going to lose anything. All you get is you either get one or you get the other. So in these kinds of conditions, there's no endowment, therefore no potential loss, which means that loss aversion in principle might not speak to choosing the mug versus choosing the money. But what we found was that we still get something like an endowment effect. So whenever we ask people to choose the money over the mug, that's like selling to get the money. We had higher prices that were larger amounts of money that were compared to what's the amount for which you would still choose the mug over the money, which is kind of this conceptually similar to buying the mug. So if that difference here on the right is not predicted by loss aversion, so maybe the difference between selling and buying on the left might also not just be about loss aversion. Of course, the difference here on the left is slightly larger. It may be that difference could be about loss aversion. We're not saying that like we can't rule that out, of course. But I think the data that we have here really raises a question as to, well, okay, there may be something else going on in addition to loss aversion, if there's loss aversion going on. But then what's it about, right? So our answer to that basically takes you back to Japan in the Middle Ages. This is Kenko, a monk from that time, who published a famous book called Essays in Idleness. And in that Essays in Idleness, he had aphorisms, and one of the aphorisms that he wrote was, "If nothing will be gained by changing something, it is better not to do so." And that seems relatively intuitive, I think. To me it does, and I could imagine that it seems relatively intuitive to you too. And what he's saying there really is that, like, be conservative in some sense. Unless you have a reason to act, don't act. Like, if there's a good reason to be doing something, if there's a good reason to be changing something, then go for it. But if nothing will be gained by changing something, well, it's better not to do anything. Okay, and so the way that we think of the effects that I just shown you, the endowment effect and the analogous effect in the choosing conditions where there's no losses, is in terms of conservatism. And I'll give you a very brief exposition here, because my focus here is not primarily on all of the all of the notions, the arguments that we have for why conservatism makes a lot of sense here. But I hope that I do in enough detail that you get the gist of the argument. Well, why might one want to be conservative in general, and why might that explain what's going on in our endowment effect study? Well, our theoretical starting point here is a conceptualization in which we say, okay, you have some, like, you like the mug to some degree, and you also like money to some degree, and there's going to be some amounts of money for which you're sure you really like the mug is not worth that much to you. And there's other amounts of money for which you're sure the mug is worth more than that to you. So in my illustration here on the left, in the bottom left, kind of, we could think about somebody saying, yeah, sure, if it's more than $10, $10 is really better than the mug. If it's less than $7, now the mug is really better than 5 or than 4 or than 6 or something like that. Okay, so I have clearly defined preferences on either side of this range. But within that range, we say, like, the way we think about this, your preferences might not be defined. So we use a concept that economists have used to study these kinds of phenomena, where you basically say you have a preference order, but the preference order is not complete. There are some parts of the preference order where there is, like, it's not that X is preferred to M. It's also not that M is preferred to X. And it's also not that the two are that you're indifferent between the two. It's just that you don't have a clearly defined preference between X and M. And so this, like, upside down T is one of the ways, it's how we denote here incompletion. And we take this from economists who work with this notion. Now imagine that. So basically what I'm saying is that your value system is one in which you're sure the mug is not as good as $100. It's not as good as $11, but you're also sure that it's better than 5 or 6, but there's just no way for you to be sure that it's like 8 or 9, like how those compare with the mug. So your preferences between money and the mug for some range, some incompletion range, are not defined. So what are you going to do then? You're going to still have to do something, because I'm asking you to do it because you're in my experiment. So one thing that you could do is you could choose randomly. But if you chose randomly, then you run into kind of incoherence issues, that, like, the kinds of incoherence issues that have been studied in decision theory and decision making for a long time. So for example, you could imagine that, like, a trader comes along and says, here, you want to buy this mug from me for $9.50? And then because it's in your incompletion range, you go, well, no, yes, I don't know. Yeah, okay, I'll buy it. Yeah, so I just choose randomly yes. At a different time later on, the trader might come back to you and say, do you want to sell me back the mug for $7.50? And then you're like, well, that's in my incompletion range, so I don't really know, but yeah, why not? Right? So if you did that, then you're effectively falling into a trap where, even though neither of the two trades by itself contradicts your preferences, because you don't have preferences over that incompletion range that I'm talking about, the combination of the two makes you worse off. So your preferences, and you do have preferences for having more money rather than less, and at the end you're basically back in the same situation, but you have $2 less. So the combination of two trades that by themselves would be arbitrary and would be kind of consistent with your non-existent preferences between $7 and $10 makes you worse off. Okay, so like in this line of work, the broader question that we're asking is, well, what should you do when you don't have preferences? And there's previous work on this. So George Mandler's an economist in I'm sorry, George Mandler's son is an economist in London, and he first had this work on like basically examines the same kind of setting that we're looking at here and shows that being conservative, so not acting unless you have a good reason to, avoids simple incoherence traps of the kind that I've just shown you. And what we argue in a paper that was just yesterday accepted for publication, so that's wonderful, is that like conservatism plus treating past choices as precedents for preferences, and I'm not going to go into detail here, I'll just blur over this, can avoid simple traps of the kind that Mandler's worried about. It can also not miss out on more subtle opportunities, and it can make sense of behavioral anomalies, including endowment effects, which is where I started, but also some cost effects and coherent arbitrariness, and other behavioral phenomena. And so the upshot of this being that conservatism can be quite rational when your preferences are incomplete and you have to still make choices in one way or another. Okay, so that was the rational side. On the other hand, like if you like, I'm talking about the psychology of losses here. This question of how to choose without preferences. Well, conservatism can be psychologically compelling. As I said, Kenko's aphorism seems natural to me. It seems much more natural to me than like some counterparts that he didn't write, such as if nothing will be lost by changing something, it is better to do so. Or if nothing will be gained by leaving something unchanged, it is better not to do so. Neither of those have the same kind of intuitive ring as if nothing will be gained by changing something, just leave it as it is. There's also been work in decision making where David Gall has argued quite prominently for a psychological law of inertia, which is a close notion to something like the conservatism that we advance, and in a really kind of different theoretical setup. So in these drift diffusion models, there's work by Studipati and colleagues who argue for a pre-valuation bias towards rejection, which is again like a kind of coming at something like conservatism. So like not to do something, I have a bias towards not to do something based on the choices and response times that people look at in this domain of research. Okay, so coming back to kind of the distinction between conservatism and loss aversion. Well, the issue is that in many studies, inaction preserves the status quo and therefore avoids losses. It also avoids gains, of course, but in this kind of setup, then loss aversion and conservatism can usually make identical predictions. So we had to think about what are settings in which we're going to make different predictions from what you get from loss aversion. One example is what I've shown you with the mug and the money. So if you don't have any potential losses, like choosing between the mug and choosing the money, then loss aversion doesn't make any prediction. And you can also try to unconfound inaction and the potential losses. So you can kind of separate those two, and that's what I'll talk about next. Note that most of this doesn't really directly falsify loss aversion. I'm not arguing that loss aversion can't be right. What I am arguing is that there are some that conservatism and loss aversion, there's many effects that you can explain via both of them. But then I also show you some here that you can only really explain in terms of conservatism, and that overall, I think, means that conservatism as an overarching parsimonious explanation of all of these effects makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we talked about the endowment effect. One other signature finding that is often taken as evidence for loss aversion is people's reluctance to take mixed gambles. In particular, this is an even mixed gamble where you can win or lose $10 depending on on a flip of a coin. And when we ran a version like this, which is like the way much classic research on the reluctance to accept mixed gambles instrumentalizes this, we got the classic reluctance to play mixed gambles. On the other hand, Ido and Eyal have been working. This is actually what I'm showing you here is not going to be news to you either, or anybody who's read your papers. We effectively just replicate what they were doing, where we.
It is useful to see that some of your results are replicable. That's a nice surprise.
Okay, thanks. So basically we contrast the classic version of a would you like to play this or not, yes, no, with a version in which you basically make it more like a choice, two alternative forced choice setup, where it's like option A, option B. In one of them you have the mixed gamble, in the other one you don't win or lose anything. And so the idea is that the yes no framing of this really emphasizes the fact that one of them is a greater act and the other one is doing less. So like if I'm choose to like, so if my general version of conservatism is don't act unless you have to, then in the top, it's very clear that the act is, yes, I want to play the gamble. In the bottom, like, of course, there's still a greater deviation from the status quo in option A than there is in option B, but both option A and option B require some commitment in terms of I want to choose this option or I want to choose the other option. So we thought that psychologically, conservatism may matter more in the top framing, where it is very evident what is the greater act and what is not, than in the bottom framing. And that, replicating Ido's results, is exactly what we found. We found a clear reluctance to play the mixed gamble whenever it was framed as a greater act. We found, you can see approximate risk neutrality when we framed the choice in terms of a two alternative forced choice setup. We also ran this actually not just with, these were hypothetical. We ran it with $10. We also ran it with $100, and we found the same pattern there, but more risk aversion, consistent with previous findings that you find that when you increase the stakes, you get more risk aversion. Okay, so neither the framing effect, neither that this framing matters, nor the approximate risk neutrality under an action framing are consistent with the idea that losses matter more than gains. They are consistent with our notion of conservatism. Okay, and the last study that I'll show you gets at the same kind of thing again, but from a really quite different angle, I think. Here, what we did was, okay, well, it's not just in the classic problems that we have in the lab and when we study decision making that we might sometimes have incomplete preference. It might also be in terms of attitudes towards different kinds of activities or art forms or food or so out there in the world. And we thought that one way to get at this would be to say, well, we're going to look at active attitude assertion versus passive attitude assertion. And here, this is effectively the active one. Here, the idea is read the statements and then think about whether it's true for you. And then if it's true for you, write a check mark to the left of the statement. So if you like running, then check, I like running. If you like thrillers, check, I like thrillers. We contrasted this with a condition, which is what I'm showing here now a little towards the middle of the screen, where instead of saying if a statement is true for you, then write a check, we said if a statement is not true for you, cross out the statement. So if the statement is true for you, just leave the statement unmarked. Now here, what is an action changes between the active and the passive assertion, of course. The action is checking at the top, and the action is crossing out at the bottom. And if there's a general tendency for you to not act if you're not sure, then you would imagine that people are neither going to check an item when they're not sure, nor cross it out. So you're going to get differences where you're going to get more liking when liking is expressed passively, so where you don't have to commit to I like heavy metal or whatever it is here on the left, but you just leave it blank, and that means you like it, than when you have to make the act or like commit the act and check I like heavy metal. Okay, and that is what we found. These are all the different stimuli that we examined here: running, thrillers, Diet Pepsi, and so on. They were all on one sheet of paper, and it was between subjects whether you did active liking or passive liking. As you can see, the passive liking bars, the blue ones, are in general higher than the red ones. Where for some it's quite spectacular. Like here, for example, if you ask people, do you like modern art? There's lots of people who don't say they dislike modern art, but there are much fewer people who affirmatively say, I like modern art, right? That's effectively what you find here. If you collapse across all 16 of the items, you get a robust difference where you have more passive liking, so that when it doesn't require an act, then active liking. In the paper, we kind of, I don't want you to read the details here. The only kind of the upshot of the analysis that we present in the paper is that there's a whole bunch of effects that can be explained by conservatism, which is the lots of red yeses here in the top, some of which are also explained by loss aversion. Others require ancillary assumptions about reference points, can be explained in terms of loss aversion, but it's a little bit more complicated. And then finally, the ones that I've just shown you really are examples of studies that are explained by conservatism but are not explained by loss aversion. And so overall, we think that this really suggests that conservatism plays a role in these phenomena that are usually attributed to loss aversion, right? That's what was here on the right. The bigger picture of all this, which I think might be interesting when we think about the psychology of losses, is that like in the traditional Kahneman-Tversky way of looking at the psychology of losses, effectively all the heavy lifting is done by evaluation. So it's about how much I subjectively value things, and it's about the convexity of the value function that gives you things like risk seeking for losses. It's about the loss aversion, so losses mattering more than gains, that gives you the endowment effect and status quo maintenance and other effects that I've just mentioned. Both the convexity of the value function, so the diminishing sensitivity there to outcomes, and the loss aversion are about evaluation. In the way that we look at it, really there's like both lower level processes that are involved in this, which is in particular the perception of numbers, which I think we have like pretty good evidence for that it matters. That's what in our framework drives the decelerating number perception, drives the risk seeking for losses on standard numerical scales. On the other hand, you also have higher level cognitive processes that are not themselves about evaluation. So the notion of you don't have a well-defined preference, but you still have to choose, you still have to implement one action or another. At that level, you might have conservatism, and that gives you the endowment effects and status quo maintenance and the other phenomena that I mentioned. In terms of the way of looking at decisions in terms of system 1 and system 2, this breaks down this kind of neat separation that there is in that particular way of looking at things. So Kahneman in his Nobel Prize lecture, for example, really emphasizes how intuition in decision making is like perception, but it's separate from perception. And what we're suggesting is, well, perception really is just a part of what you're doing when you're making these choices. You can't separate system 1 that neatly from perception. Part of what we study when we study how people make decisions between different options is how they perceive these options, no? And that is something that we have to take into account. Okay, so the summary here is that, like in our alternative view on the psychology of losses, well, prospect theories behavior predictions depend on conditions that might be narrower than we thought, and that might be somewhat and so therefore they might be somewhat less likely to generalize outside the lab than we've thought before. It goes beyond this analogy to perception. It's really that perceptual processes are directly implicated in studying decision making, and also psychologically, losses might then resemble gains more closely than we've previously thought. And I'd like to thank my brilliant co-authors in California. So all of this work that I've presented was in close collaboration with Shlomi Sher, who's at Pomona College, and also with Craig McKenzie at UC San Diego, who I did my postdoc with some years back. And I'd also like to thank Robin, who passed away earlier this year. He was my PhD supervisor. I saw him regularly over the last year since I moved back to Barcelona, and this is among the last but it is in fact the last work that he gave me feedback on, that we talked about at length over the course of the last couple of years or so. So thank you to all three of them, and thank you very much for the opportunity to give this talk and for coming and connecting to the talk. And I'm happy to take questions. Okay, I don't know how this works.
So
Yeah,
it
Finn,
was
do you
very
do this or?
interesting. And now it's time for questions. So I see Yossi, you already have a question, so please go ahead. You're on mute. Oh, cool. Now not, but we still don't hear you. So as for now, Ido?
So Yossi is okay. Yeah, so yeah, very nice talk. You know, but by the way, when we first organized this meeting, we planned to do that, to have people describe a paper when it immediately when it's published, so people can use it. So very nice that your paper was accepted yesterday or something like that. I would like to talk about, so I like your results, definitely they're convincing, especially replicating my results, but I wonder about the interpretation. So your interpretation is very elegant and consistent with elegant economic theory, but I think that most of your results can also be explained if you would think about, less elegant but more consistent with this seminar is about past experiences. So, for example, the way we explain our result, that why people don't are more likely to reject a lottery when they're being, because it is my experience when someone send me an email and send me $50, and with high probability I will send you back 2,000 or 2 million, I don't send him. So if someone give you come to you and offer you a deal, then it's a good idea not to do anything. Whereas in other situation, when people actually appear to, this is actually not me, this is Kenneth Arrow, and I didn't hear it myself, but Guru Uberman used to say that Kenneth Arrow complained about behavioral economy. I don't think he ever wrote about it, but so all what I can say is that Guru Uberman said that Kenneth Arrow used to say that the most important problem in behavioral economics is that people buy and sell stocks without good reason. So, and these stupid people that deviate from rational choice because buying and selling is costly, they determine the prices in the stock market. So all the market is depending on this deviation. So these guys behave exactly the opposite of your model because there's no reason to buy and sell, and they just go and buy and sell. So I think the results are I agree that they robust and important. The question is, do you really believe that this is because of this fear of being exploited for indifference, or maybe this is because we have the experience that in many situations, if someone offers us a deal, we should reject it. But sometimes we also have a feeling that if we don't do something, then we will lose. And this is where you get these people buying and selling. So is a way to compare these two explanations, or just I have to go with you because your explanation is more elegant, I have to admit. But
well, thanks very much first for the feedback and for the question. I think that I think that learning relates to this for sure, and there's more than one way in which it relates to it. One is that like sometimes like it may not be clear to us whether we really have incomplete preference, like truly incomplete preference, where there's no where even if I have all the information available to me, I still don't have a preference between one and the other, and I just can't trade them off, because this I think is especially compelling when you think about like complex decisions in life, where you think about like a job or another job or a relationship and another relationship. They may just be incommensurate. You could say, okay, this is better on that dimension, that's better on this dimension, but I just don't have a way of like getting those all onto the same scale and then saying this is really better than that. So in that domain, I think so that's one type in which you can have incomplete preferences, but it's not always obvious to us whether that's the case or we just don't have enough information. And if we had more information, then we now would be able to construct a proper ordering of the different options, and we would know that that one is better than this one. So I think one way in which learning is super important to what we're saying is in this way. And that's something that we just, our analysis falls short of this. We don't have a definite answer for when one is more important than when the other is important. The kind of multi-attribute example that I just gave is really just an intuition of mine. The other thing is, I do think that in the trading context especially, so I think this I might even apply more to the endowment effect study that I showed than to the gamble study. The gamble study is the one that you've shown it in before. I think it can also apply there, but the way you talk of it in terms of lemons, there's this notion of really somebody offering you a trade, and that person maybe having more information than you, and you being kind of attuned to that and knowing that this is the kind of situation in which you shouldn't trade. If you ask me, the two versions of the endowment effect study, the two sets of conditions, the trading one has a larger endowment effect than the one where it's just choosing between the mug and the money, and it seems quite compelling to me that these trading environments, some of what you're saying is going on. It seems very, very, very intuitive to me that does some of the work for the willingness to sell, willingness to buy disparity. I do think that some general version of conservatism likely also contributes to these, and it has the advantage that you can account for lots of different phenomena in this way. And I actually genuinely think that the notion of our preferences not being complete is psychologically extremely appealing. It's something that is hard to work with in terms of the math, and so even though there is work in economics where people have looked at kind of the theory of this and then have taken it to some places, I think it's not that it's not that easy to work in that world, and so maybe that's part of why it hasn't become that popular, but I find it psychologically extremely compelling. But again, I'm not making a strong claim that no other things are also going on, and I think particularly in the domain of trading, it seems very likely to me that there's also other things going on. Yeah, other questions?
Okay, do we have other questions? We have time for one quick question because we have about 2 minutes before the end of the formal part. Any buyers? So I will
Now
ask.
you scared them off. They don't frame it as a willingness to buy thing. They're going to be conservative.
I will ask a quick question. I liked your result about the difference in preferences when it's when you have to choose to opt in and to opt out, basically. Can you disentangle it from the default effect? I mean, if I'm indifferent, I think about myself and I have to decide what to eat for the dinner, it's a real pain. If my wife asks me if I want a fish, I say sure. And if she asks me if I want meat, I also say sure. So my question is, whatever, if I don't have strong preferences, I just say whatever. Yeah, I like art, I dislike art. Whatever you choose for me is fine with me.
So I tend to think that one way in which you can relate what we're doing to the default effects is that a general tendency for conservatism will also contribute to default effects, right? It's something that will lead you in general in the direction of going for the thing that requires the least action, which in the setup of default effects is the default. But again, it's a setting in which it's probably then in practice, how much of it is that and how much of it is something else is a different question that is harder to answer, where you can imagine default effects presumably might still work when you have a definite preference, but it's the kind of utility difference between the two items is just not that large, and you find the action that it takes to choose the other thing, to like that action might have a disutility, that kind of thing can certainly exist. So I don't think that would be ruled out by the way that we're thinking about this either.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is running up. So now we are over with the formal part. And we thank you again. And those who have to leave, this is the time to leave. And we will still continue, if it's fine with you, with informal discussion for a few more minutes.
Of course. Thank you very much for coming to the talk, everybody. Thank you.
So I think I will stop the recording for now.